Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. I'm Jess Larson, and I am extremely excited for this episode. We get to have Ed Zwick. If you don't know the movies Last Samurai and Blood Diamond and Glory and a whole bunch of others we're going to talk about today, I feel bad for you because they're some of my favorite movies. And when I saw Ed's new book come out, I bought it immediately, and I finished it this week and was so happy when he was willing to do the show. Ed, thank you so much for coming.
It's my pleasure.
So Ed, you've had such an incredible career, Legends of the Fall, all these movies. And I'm sure people ask you to pick your favorites. But instead, what I want to do is ask you what your favorite learnings were on different of the films. Would you pick a film and tell us what your favorite thing learning on that one was?
Yeah, that's actually it rises up quickly in my mind. It's I think it was Glory. I mean, the most obvious, learning curve was to take something of that scale after what I'd done was much more intimate and domestic, if you will. But in fact, that was only the beginning because, the learning was to discover a subject whose depth and intensity and profundity just kept expanding the deeper I got into it. Not just as I researched it, but even in the process, because I encountered that it had a significance and a resonance far beyond anything that I could even ever totally understand then and even now. And I think that came from the men who joined me in it. I think it came from an extraordinary group of actors who had such personal investment in the subject and a personal understanding of their own history and parents and grandparents and families. Morgan Freeman ended up at the end of the movie when he had money. He bought the plantation on which his family had been slaves. Men came from all over the United States, lawyers and doctors and military, because they had heard of the story and felt that it needed to be told and wanted to participate. And for me, that lesson, such as it was to take a step back when you were in the presence of something bigger even than yourself and to let it happen rather than try to overdetermine it. And that was humbling, but in the best way, that sometimes a thing takes on a life of its own. And if you are in awe of it and try to serve it rather than trying to shape it, then I think it can become bigger than anything you imagined. And that's been the story of that movie. And I think one reason that it has continued to be somewhere in the popular imagination or in schools or whatever is because it has that kind of what's the word? A permanence, that kind of that it remains present whenever anyone sees it because it participates in out of time in some way. And that's the lesson. The lesson was that sometimes the best thing to do is nothing at all. That there are moments that you can actually give over. And the temptation as a director often is to try to, be that authority figure, be in control. And that's not to say I wasn't doing all the things that a director does, but it's a much more psychological notion of, trying to listen deeply to what's happening around you.
I read screenwriting books for fun. I read directors' books for fun. I have been doing my best to hang on to the coattails of the few Hollywood friends that I have and learn about your space. But something that I have never gotten until your book is the depth of the collaboration effect, where you still need to be a rudder, but that's giving up control without giving up direction. I don't know how to say it right. What would you say about that?
That's well put. And ironically, you just maybe intuitively went to a nautical phrase. You said rudder. And there's an analogy that I've used in the book as well, which is of a sort of a 17th century sailing ship. And on that sailing ship, everyone is a master craftsman. The man who makes the sails, the navigator, the cook, the ship's carpenter. They're all just at the top of their field. And yet none of them are standing in the prow of the ship, with their beard blown back, their hair blown back, spittle flying everywhere, yelling, I know the way, follow me. But, he doesn't really know, but he has an idea. And there's a group fiction, which is to say he does, and they agree to follow him. And because that's either his calling or his choice or what's been imposed on him to be that person. And all of them probably in some other, lifetime could have been that person, but they've chosen their individual crafts. But the thing that you learn about a film is that they are all making the film too. They're telling the story in their own way. The props tell a story. The costumes tell a story. The light tells a story. And to go back to the nautical metaphor, everyone is in this odd voyage in pursuit of some ineffable thing, a story. Sometimes it would have been looking for gold or diamonds or riches or slaves, some horrible, that was out there. And they're all in inclement conditions, eating bad food, stuck together for long periods of time, sleepless. And yet there's this very rough good humor among the group of people that have become this, it's not a startup, it's not a store, it's not a business, it's this journey that you're all on together. And then you part. And that's another part of it. The fact that it ends and you separate. Sometimes some of you find each other on other ships, and some people you never see again, and you've had this intense experience together. And so it's a unique process. And I realized that was the lens through which I could write about it.
There's so many great performances in there, and people know all the famous actors, the Matthew Broderick's and Lawrence Fishburne's and Denzel Washington and stuff. But I was born in 1980, so you've got a character in there that everybody my age knows as the Dread Pirate Roberts from The Princess Bride.
Yeah,
I want to talk about somebody like that who maybe isn't like the number one actor that got you the financing position, but I saw a performance out of him I haven't seen in any other movies. Can you talk about that?
Well, I can talk about Cary Elwes and others, but Cary had this moment in Princess Bride and could have taken this course of, toward that heroic leading man, but he's a more substantial person who actually had an ambition to participate in things that had meaning. And when he read the script, and they very easily could have tried to hold us up and say he needs this money and this prestige. He went for none of that. He said, no, I want to be part of it, and I will play ball in the way that everyone else was, as did Morgan Freeman, as did the rest of them, as did Denzel. And ironically, his career has been very different than one might have expected, and yet it is still vibrant. He's found a way to do that great work in one movie or another, being a little bit eccentric in some of his choices. And I think he could write a whole different book about supporting players. Yeah, I think it's not a coincidence that 3 different supporting actors in my movies have been nominated for Oscars, because I find myself drawn to those characters as I write them and as I direct them, because in some way the supporting actor is allowed to be a little bit more vivid and a little bit grander than the protagonist. The laconic hero tends to be within a certain range, because that is what is it? They're more targeted in their pursuit. They're the steady line through which everyone else is cycling, vibrating, and whatnot. And the extremities of supporting actors often represent extremes in philosophical positions, emotional positions. So they're allowed to be a little bit more, florid in that way. And, I can literally go through it. Matt Damon in Courage Under Fire, Tony Shalhoub in The Siege. Elizabeth Perkins and Jim Belushi in my first movie. I'm sure I'm forgetting all sorts of great performances, but that's ironically been been a favorite. And I thought, the fact that you notice it and think about it, no movie is better than its supporting parts. In fact, they're the ones that give it the color and the accent that it needs.
That's such an interesting perspective. Um, so if you had to give advice to another director who had to take your place and get the best out of Carrie there, what's your advice?
Of Carrie?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's no different than I would give to anybody about anything in terms of getting a performance. It's trying to get to know the person, trying to understand what their process is, but also create a situation which they can feel comfortable and spontaneous, so as to make those moments singular and real. And I'll just give you a silly example from Glory, but it's there. On the soundtrack of the movie, in the scene that Denzel is being whipped, Carrie and Matthew are off stage, and because the camera is in that one shot of Denzel, and to get the sound right, off stage you hear someone weeping, and that was Carrie. That's off stage. He was so immersed in that moment. It wasn't on camera. It was just hitting him. And, that's, when an actor's acting off camera, they're often doing it for another actor or just for the moment.
That's fascinating. I love in the book where you talk about that single tear during that scene.
Yeah.
I felt like I was there as you're describing it just in the book. When I want to ask the same question for Denzel. I mean, his character there, it's like you get like this like soul to soul connection. Like there's electricity cord between the two of us coming through the screen, except to millions of people watching the movie.
Right.
Can you talk about giving him the room, plus giving direction, plus like supplying the environment for him to be him?
Yeah, it's a long, complicated story, and I'm not sure it's worth going into all of the details of it, except to say that part of it was manipulative on my part. Part of it, obviously, I hope was generous, but most of all, it was his ability to understand the duality of his job, which is to say, something is happening emotionally in that moment. And even though it's in the context of 50 people and a lens coming at your face and lights and the awareness of the performance moment, the more contrived context of it, it's to maintain that very personal reaction and yet know that you want to have your face in the right angle to catch the light and there's a mark on the ground, and to somehow do those things simultaneously is so remarkable when it happens. And that's what the great actors can do. They can do both those things at once. What are you thinking?
I think about it for the whole film. Like, I don't even mean just that piece. I mean, when he says, "I still don't want to carry your flag." I mean, the whole performance out of him. I guess my advice is that I'm looking for from you is like, as a hopeful potential director at some point in my life, if I ever have the opportunity to work with someone of that caliber, or if anybody listening ever does, guidance for us in general to when you're working with talent at that level, to give them enough room, plus enough direction, plus creating the environment for them to bring their best and want to bring their best. And just, I mean, it feels like there's so many moving parts to allow them to be the magic that they are. And maybe I'm putting too much on this though.
No, but it's the irony is that they're all different. Every person comes to it often from a very different background. Anthony Hopkins in Legends of the Fall is from the National Theater, having been raised doing all of that. And yet he, as a kid, loved Westerns and could do imitations of Lee J. Cobb and Lee Marvin and John Wayne. So there's that. Aidan Quinn was from the Remains Theater and the Experimental Theater in Chicago and came through a very different process. Brad Pitt had very little classical training, but had extraordinary instincts. Henry Thomas had been a child star, and yet, so the child actors have a very different experience, and yet your job is to try to understand what language works individually for all of them, or how to establish a common language. And sometimes that's done by rehearsal. Sometimes it's done by showing them who you are and what works best for you, and they can adapt. But it's also about giving them what they need individually. And every woman that you have ever kissed feels that the way she wants to be kissed is the only way anyone has ever wanted to be kissed. And yet, I suspect if you've kissed more than one person in your life, you would have discovered that people are infinitely, varied in their responses to stimuli, to emotion, to sexuality, all of it. And so it's a little bit about you being supple and being a little bit protean in your way to move. And yet, tell me if I'm going on. This is still
this is super, because I've got to tell you, I remember extremely vividly.
I'm not talking about Stanislavski. I'm not talking about Uta Hagen. Yes, all those things are important. Yes, you read them all, you learn them all, you go to class, you do those things, you do the exercises. But at the end, it's deeply intuitive.
Well, I want to talk about this. I remember extremely vividly when Tim Fawns, my best friend, who was kind of a cowboy, we were in this little farm town in Western Canada, and his dad took me. I think what year did Legends of the Fall come out?
Well, it might have been 90. What? Wait, no.
93?
92 or something like that, 2 or 3. Yeah.
I remember very distinctly being like a 13-year-old boy, and this was like the first grown-up movie I was allowed to see in the movie theater, kind of a thing. And it was an experience I'd never had in my life, and specifically Brad Pitt. So I want to talk about it with him in that movie. What did you sense about him? What did you pick up on, and how were you able to personalize your directing to him for that performance?
It took a while because I think he was very new to that role of being the leading man, and it requires an extraordinary amount of confidence and understanding of that position. And in some way, in Brad's mind, his love of movies and of acting was not to be that person. I think he wanted to be the more eccentric supporting actor. He loved David Thewlis. There were people that he responded to who were not the obvious icons. And so what I came to understand is that Brad he has a volatility underneath that's belied by this very handsome, very charming surface. And the question was how to evoke those things, right? And because that's the nature of the character. The character is volatile. The character is reactive. And so it was in there. And ironically, one of the ways that it came out was that we became a little bit combative. We differed on certain things as to what the interpretation might be of a scene or even of a line, and sometimes we got into it. And because he's a really good guy, he understood that energy is not malign in any way, that it's, in fact, it can be constructive. So at the time, though, that's a little scary. You're getting into these things, and sometimes they're heated because you're both passionate and you're loud and there are people around you, and it can be a little bit, destabilizing for a group. But then when you see the work and it's there and you've got it once on focus, in focus, on film, then you move on to the next and it's forever there. And so you do what you have to do. He did what he had to do to get to that place. I did what I had to do to get it what I wanted to, and then you have it as it's going to be. Not necessarily what you may have predicted or wanted, and not necessarily what he may have wanted, but this third thing that's created, which is the legacy of your interaction. He understands what I'm asking for, and whether he understands that in terms of actions and obstacles and classical acting talk, or whether he understands it just from the tone of my voice or my biorhythms, my posture, how I talk about something, how I'm talking to someone else, that's communicated to him, and he's communicating to me, and what he's doing in front of that camera. And the hardest thing for me, or any director, I think, is to actually see what's happening as the camera sees it. When you see it in dailies, it's too late. I mean, sometimes you can go back and shoot certain things, but the hardest thing is to divest yourself of your expectations and your anxieties and what you had for dinner and the fight that you had with your partner and the studio's pressure on you about the budget and all of those things, and try to be present, because that's what you're going to get. And if it's not what you want, then you have to find a way to move it, caress it, push it, pull it.
What's an example? What's an example of one of the experiments where you're trying to caress it, you're trying to pull it?
Oh, there are 100 ways. The worst way is to say, be angrier, be faster, some result, stupid direction. And even worse is to try to give him a line reading, because then that's garbage in, garbage out. You're going to get what you gave, and you're not the leader, the actor, and it's not going to happen. But, there are metaphors. It's like the water is rising around your ankles, and you've got to try to, to put your hand into the dike. There's a sound next door, and it sounds like that there are people with guns coming up the stairs. There are animal metaphors, and there are as if, or even there are even manipulations, which is to say you're too powerful for him in this scene, as opposed to say, tone it the fuck down. There are ways that are subtle and ways that are actually, I've told people, who seem to be absent the inner life of what is needed for the camera to see, is to say, you have a very big secret right now. Don't tell her. And so now all of a sudden you've created something else inside that actor. And what you get is not then on the word. You get something more interesting. And sometimes interesting is just enough.
That is really meaningful advice. If we had like a 6-hour interview, I'd tell you all the things that makes me think, but instead we're going to listen to you instead of me. I want to switch gears. Again, just being the age that I am, maybe it was jealousy, but all of the cute girls I liked didn't like me. They liked Leonardo DiCaprio from Titanic. Okay. So there was a real thing amongst, and I was part of like the skaters, artists, snowboarder groups. And so we extra had a thing against Leo. Okay. And then I saw him in Blood Diamond and I flip-flopped. And everything changed for me and my feelings about him as an actor and everything in Blood Diamond. Can you talk about how you picked up on what he was going to need and what the subtleties were and how you read the situation and helped create what my generation thought was a whole new Leo?
Well, there's a moment in every actor's life who's a really good actor where they do make a transition from young, cute leading man to leading man. And part of that I think is about owning and expressing some of the darker colors that are inside, that are not charming, that are not pleasing, that are not aching to be liked in any way. And I think as you've watched Leo's career from that moment, I think some of the choices he made, and that was happening at the same time, by the way, he made Departed at the same moment. So this is a transitional moment in his career. And I think he saw that it was a whole new canvas opening up for him in which he could branch into different kinds of colors and different kinds of emotions and experiences. And in this movie, I encouraged him to go there. He was hanging out with guys who had been at that time in Rhodesia in the army, guys who he met guys who were smugglers. When you work on that accent, the best way to do it, besides the drilling and the repetition and the study, is to be around people who have that. And that's another thing that he did. But it's really about in a real total immersion in another character who is not asking for the audience's approval, and so many actors make that mistake where they're worried about that. And I know, and once he got that, he leaned into some of the subtle racism, some of those violent. I'll give you something that he did. Just this is a silly example. There's a moment when they have to cross a bridge, and he's with Jaimin, and he pretends that Jaimin is his prisoner, and they start walking toward these guys, and he shoots them both in order to get across the bridge. And it was not in the script, what I'm about to tell you. He shoots them, they're down, they're walking across the bridge, and as he walks past, he puts 2 more in each of their heads because he just wants to make sure. Brutal, not scripted, but that is a very an impulse of somebody who has inhabited that character. And Eduardo Serra, who's a genius, who I was lucky enough to work with a couple of times as the director of photography, is a very, very wise man. He made great movies in France, mostly. But he said something once. He said the thing about Leonardo. He said, you know that he is a fallen angel, that there is good in him, and it doesn't matter how far he goes into that dark side, you'll allow that because something about him, and in fact, it is his nature. He is a good person. He's actually a very committed political person. He's a kind person. That is going to emanate. And so whenever you get 2 things playing simultaneously, it's interesting, as opposed to that on the nose, obvious portrayal of a thing. I can think of a lot of actors who would not have done it. It would have been okay, but it would not have lifted up.
Well, I wish we had, I wish we could do like a session for every single one of your movies, and we'll just do an hour on every movie. But I really, really want to talk about writing. But before we do that,
Sure.
I want to ask you what you did as a director to create the environment for the chemistry between Ken Watanabe and Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai, because by the end of that film, you just feel like a brotherhood, like you want to join their brotherhood.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things that go into that kind of thing, and yet they're not always those that you understand while you're doing them. Often after the fact, it becomes clear. I would begin with one side, which is that in Japan, when I was doing this movie, and it started to change now, but casting was often hierarchical. The person you cast as the biggest lead is the person with the biggest career. And by rights, Hiroyuki Sanada, who was playing his major domo, who played the swordsman, who now, by the way, who's revealed himself when he just did Shogun. But at that time, he was the Tom Cruise of Japan. And everyone said, no, that's who you have to cast as Katsumoto. And I loved Sanada, and I wanted him to be that supporting lead, but I didn't feel him in that kind of majestic, towering figure that Katsumoto had to be. And in fact, when you saw him play the daimyo in Shogun, that's who he is, which is much more contained, much more internal, fantastic. But point is, Ken had some inhibition about that. His career had some hard times. Was in debt to his representatives because they were yakuza. There were all sorts of things going on with him. And Sonata, in saying no, I will support him, created this. It was so generous, and that was part of what let him rise up. But the thing that really did it was Tom Cruise, because there's the biggest movie star in the world saying to him, we're into this together. You're gonna come into my trailer. He has an exercise thing on there. We're gonna work out every morning at 4 a.m. together in what he called his pain cave. And the two of them did the sword work together. They did the so much of that, and they got into these sort of crazy. What can I say? I relate to Tom because we both wrestled in high school. There's a kind of head space that you have to get into, which is such a psych ferocity of purpose that he and Ken got into that together, and it spills over. They not only like each other, but they become these sort of appreciation of each other's humor, and they drive each other. Ken is a very funny guy too, and initially he was a little bit reluctant to show that, but once he saw that was going to be great, that all came out too. So it became a real relationship, and after you've been in the rain, in the mud, doing this day after day, falling off horses, doing stunts, all of it, there is this bond, and it shows on the film.
Yeah, it certainly does. I did different martial arts all my growing up years, but my teenage years were competitive judo. And
Well,
I've always just had this lifelong fascination with Japan. So from the movie poster, you had me. And then when the movie delivered, it was just
great.
excellent. So I want to talk about writing. For me, I feel like writing is drastically underappreciated in Hollywood. That people don't understand.
Historically underappreciated. It's going back to the 1920s and 30s.
Can you describe, for people who don't really understand, just how vital excellent writing is to get an excellent page? There's a very logical aspect of it, but I feel like so many people miss it. Can you talk about the value of excellent writing?
Well, I know. I mean, those who know are just unequivocal. I mean, Alfred Hitchcock once said there are 3 things that you need to make a great movie: the script, the script, and the script. It literally is. You can't make a house without a blueprint, but not just a blueprint, but someone who imagines what it is to live in that house, how it would be to actually heat that house, furnish that house. Will it stand in a storm? Does it have an aesthetic beauty? Everything about a script, if it's a really good script, the writer has gone through the same process in his mind as a thought exercise, as a thought problem that the actor and the director and everyone else is going to have to go through. That writer will have literally anticipated what that emotional arc is for a character in each scene, and how it differs and how it conflicts with another character in that scene, so as to create the tension and the shape of a scene. She will have Susan Shilladay in Legends. She will have become, a 90-year-old Cree Indian telling a story, so as to be able to be in his head as he tells it. And why does he say what he says, and why is he held back from what he's saying, and what does it mean to be a Native American at that moment, as opposed to now? The idea of not creating circumstances where an actor has to just fake everything so as to make something happen. There's an expression that Marshall and I use sometimes, which is to say, not making an actor go around a corner on three wheels. In other words, a transition that just, you can't have done that transition for the sake of plot. You have to have done it that's appropriate intrinsically to that person internally. And because that person is doing something that they need to do, that seems right and that seems believable, plausible, and that then turns the plot. If you put an actor in a situation of having to say the emotion, say the thing that has to be done because the writer says they have to do it, it's going to seem naff. It's literally trying to understand what the experience is and what the dynamic is between all the people all the time. And so when they get there on the stage, when the director looks at the scene, it's obvious where that person should sit. It's obvious who should come in first. It's obvious what the intensity is of that moment based on the fact that it's on page 78 as opposed to on page 22. That's a dead giveaway as to what pitch the scene is at or what its import is. And so I think it's like so many things because it seems more anonymous. The writer doesn't then step ahead of the movie and represent it somehow. The auteur theory created this kind of ridiculous notion that the director is, only the one to be recognized. On the other hand, the director has to make it work if it doesn't work in the script. And even if he's the writer, he has to fire that person and then redo it so as to work on the stage. So there's a reason that in the finishing of a thing, the director somehow seems preeminent. But in fact, without that foundation, without all the work that has gone before with that script, you can make a you can't make a great movie out of a bad script. It's hard to make a bad movie out of a great script.
Wow, so well said. The book was so fun because you weren't pulling any punches. You were talking about the good, bad, and the ugly. Can you talk about why you chose the title for the book?
Huh. Well, there actually was a favorite quote of mine that Preston Sturges once said, that said, hit is the thing you do between flops. I love that. I love that because I learned it the hard way several times, and I think every artist learns it. I think there isn't an IMDb you can look at of somebody's, list of work and not see things that didn't work.
Well, I feel like we should tell people the name of the book is Hits, Flops, and Other Illusions. I realized you didn't say that at the beginning.
Oh yeah, thank you. For those who may be interested in actually buying a book, yeah, okay, yes. The flops are the thing that in fact are the real teachers. That disaster and failure and shame and humiliation are an essential part of the process, that they're baked in. And unless you embrace those, you actually won't have a career because you'll somehow be confined by this notion of having to please or trying to repeat what worked once. And then you become just a one-trick pony and you end up having a very boring experience personally. And I think your career reflects it. And I think that there's something about success that's essentially mystifying and oddly anxiety provoking. But in failure, you actually are stripped down to looking at what happened in this experience, what about it was good, what didn't work. You become analytical. You also discover in yourself if you have the resources and the resilience to get up off the canvas and do it again. And only if you can do that will it ultimately work out. Because, there's so many wonderful phrases. Michael Jordan says that, of all of the, 8,900 shots that he shot, there were, and an even greater number that he missed. And Wayne Gretzky saying, you only score the goals that you're willing to shoot. And I heard a wonderful, wonderful thing that, oh fuck, the Swedish, tennis star, the shoes. Oh God, it doesn't matter. That if he won 1,000 games, if you count up the points that he also lost, just a few fewer points because he won them in the final, the final game. It is uh it's oddly it's oddly comforting when something like that doesn't work. It's oddly okay. You discover your vulnerability. You discover your humility. You get out of your own ass, and I think that is a necessary thing. So therefore, the word flops. So hits is obvious. Flops is because of that. And illusions is the recognition ultimately that it's never about the outcome. In fact, it's about something else. It's about the experience. It's about the relationships you've had. It's about your dreams. It's about the ache that you have fulfilled, or the itch that you've scratched. That there was an Emily Dickinson little poem that I actually learned very young, and it was part of this, that fame is a bee. It has a song. It has a sting. Ah, yes, it has a wing. And that's it. This is a brief moment that you've been given the privilege to express yourself. You've been given the opportunity to do what you love, on somebody else's money, and it's an unbelievable reason to be grateful. And what you're left with, this, I hate to say it, but it's true. I think I can name so many of my heroes whose work is forgotten, as mine will be forgotten, as we are all forgotten. And so that is, this is, the moment of it. And the failure is part of your life. It is, amor fati. It is what you have done, and you have to own it. So therefore the illusion, um, was part of the process too. And that's where the title comes from.
Well, like I said, I loved the book. I think everybody should be going to Audible, because if you buy it on Audible, like I did, you get to actually hear Ed read the whole book. And there's just something about the voice inflections and the you were there factor that I think is a gift to the rest of us, that you took the time to read the book.
Well, I was scared to do that because I've worked with so many great actors, and I have great respect for what they could have done. And I was very tempted to try to ask, but in fact, it was the company who said, no, people want to hear, particularly, I guess, in a memoir, they want to hear the person. And there is something that, in terms of the emphases and the inflections, that probably is unique because I did it.
Yeah, I agree. Thinking about writing and specifically screenwriting, what would be your advice for aspiring writers for writing for like emotional resonance? Because you don't know who the actors are yet, and you're not actually there. And in some ways, it's a bit esoteric to imagine what this is going to be like when somebody else films it, pretending to be the character, and like writing with soul.
Boy, I mean, I wasn't able to do it really, I think, until I was about 30. I could imitate what movies sounded like. They could refer to other things that I'd heard. I think you'd always heard, oh, write what you know. Well, I didn't know anything really. I'd had a sort of a blithe childhood to some degree, but in fact, I thought it was blithe that I had never dug into some of the pain of my life, some of the pain of my relationship at home. Um, I also had some things happen to me that were profound in every direction. I fell in love, really. I had children. My mother was killed in a car accident at age 30. Um, I, began to have relationships in business that were intense and um, called into question certain values, and I was forced to actually confront how important it was to me to have money, how important it was for me to have artistic control. So many things happened. And what happens when you have these things rock you, I think it opens up the chakras that I think you can actually become more authentic in your writing and in your emotional life, and you become less afraid. Um, there is a Kafka quote which I read around that time, and it said that writing is the axe to break up the frozen sea within us. That's no, that sort of says it, and it's a violent image too. It suggests that there's pain involved in that, just personal pain of confronting certain truths and certain. But what you find when you do that is you start to find your own voice as opposed to your imitation of someone else's voice.
You know, I have a real fascination with the special operations community. And about a decade ago, I got to become an executive for a management training company, and I got to do leadership training for they let me be the director of the special operations and intelligence agencies practice of theirs.
Wow. Cool.
So, in spending time with them, the curtain got peeled back of like, these are just regular dudes. Like these
Sure.
guys, they're complaining about when their wife is nagging them. They're complaining about the mortgage. They're talking about sports, and they've got these big differences where like they're willing to let their kids grow up without a dad, so the rest of us, so the rest of our kids all get to have a dad. There's some stark differences, but there's also just um, for people I had thought about like real life superheroes, there's so much plainness about them too. Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's what I loved about your book. I haven't seen in other books about Hollywood is you're so straightforward about the disappointments. You're so straightforward about when you were snubbed by a movie star or things that if you were posturing, you wouldn't have said, but you just gave us the real truth. And it's like a gift to the rest of us.
Well, I mean, I sort of, it didn't come easily. I had certain friends who I really respect, real great writers who looked at the first draft and responded and really were encouraging, but also said, you've got to dig deeper because that's what I want to know when I read this book. That's what I want to know. And in fact, those personal things turned out to be the things. And of course, I should have known that because I've said that to every writer I've ever worked with when I'm the director. But typical, that's the shoemaker. What's that phrase? There's some phrase. Anyway, the idea that I would have had some inhibition is inevitable and typical, and yet to have gotten past it opened up a whole reservoir of feeling that I could get to. And also, I think it then allowed me, since I was taking that risk, to continue that risk and talk about other people honestly as I had. And in certain cases, if they were stupid enough to act badly in front of a writer, well, they deserve what they get.
Well, I think even just on this interview, when you said that there was a certain comfort in flops, I think that
Yeah.
your book, it's like it gets rid of the grass is greener. Oh, if only I was a famous actor who worked with Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Cruise and Denzel Washington, right? And yet you're also honest about the great parts too. And so I think for those of us who are intending to make that our life's work later, um, there's almost this comfort of like, oh shoot, maybe it's not as magical like winning the lottery appears to people who haven't won the lottery. right?
Well,
Um,
yeah.
and yet it's like, it still sounds great. I still want to do it, even hearing
Yeah,
about the
that's
warts
right.
and all.
I mean, look, what I say to people is do not do it if you can do something else. But if you have to do this, just know that it is a life full of disappointment and frustration and struggle, and yet son, extraordinary rewards and pleasures, and very high peaks. But it is manic depressive. It is a roller coaster, and not everybody's cut out for that. And in fact, you don't find out if you're cut out for it for the first 5 or 10 years. And can you weather that? Are you somebody who needs to be assured of success, or you need someone who needs to have the hallmarks of success given you right away? You're not going to get an A. You're not going to get a grade. It's not going to be evident that things are happening internally as an artist until they happen. You have to be content with a process that's going to be as long as it is, and then it will happen, or maybe it won't. And then what?
Um, you've received such great feedback on your movies over these decades, really. What's been some of your favorite feedback on the book? Like, what are the praise? What are the discoveries people have had? What's been most fulfilling for
Well,
you on the
well,
what the
first,
book has done?
first of all, I think people tend to look at entertainments like movies and TV with a very, very casual regard. It's kind of like, yeah, yeah, I saw it. Yeah, it was good. Yeah, what's for dinner? There's a certain, not disregard, but there's not that same kind of intense relationship with a book. People, you've got to invest real time. You take it to bed with you. You just have it, and you live with it for a week or all night long. Or it's a very intense experience, really, if you are a reader. And when you're writing, internally, emotionally, people respond in kind. So I've gotten amazing letters from people. I've gotten just great conversations with other artists, with just readers about what what I was trying to go for. And also from people not necessarily in my business, from people that have created startups, from people who run law firms, whose issues of dealing with prima donnas, or dealing with really high class problems, and really gifted people who are volatile. They found resonance in the book, and that was a surprise, but really delightful to think. And also, listen, I wrote the book a year ago, and it's still having some churning out there. Someone recommends it to somebody else, and you hear about it. And what you hope, of course, is that that local bookstore has sold 2 or 3 copies, in those last couple of months, and they reorder it so it stays on the shelf, and it becomes a thing that has become part of some permanent record. Because what I wrote, I think, at least one of my intentions, is that it would be something that somebody starting in the business might really like to have as a kind of Bedecker, as a kind of just a anticipatory, guidebook of what the kinds of things you might expect, not the very things, but and I think that if you're a film student, or if you're interested in that, I think that it's going to be something that you're going to prize, as there were books that did that for me.
Well, it did that for me. I want to appreciate, like, say, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for making time for this interview.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And listen, you talked about your secret dreams before we went on the air, and I'll be the first to see it, if it actually comes true. So I wish you the best with that.
Oh, thank you so much. You will definitely be on the first list. Bye,
Okay.
everyone.